Chapter 6. It was the most ridiculous room he had ever seen. It was comparatively small, and it was furnished in the overstuffed fashion of 3 generations before. It had a long, shabby sofa, lumpish chairs, and drifts of small tables. One wall was filter glass, but the other walls were covered with incongruous flowered wallpaper. And there was a fireplace with a mantel above it, a fireplace here, in this super-modern castle on the moon. 6 or 7 people sat about the room, but when Comyn came in with Sidna, they stopped talking and stared at him. He felt as if he were walking into an ambush of hostile eyes. Stanley was sitting in a corner beside one of those muffin-faced girls that, sooner or later, happened to every family. Beyond him, by the fireplace, was a shabby Morris chair. The figure seated in it was the focus of the whole room. "This is the man, grandfather," said Peter Cochrane. The burst of atomic fire out on the Mare Imbrium seemed to have burned something out of him. He had the look of one exhausted by grappling with the impossible. A voice spoke out of the old Morris chair. "You," it said. "Come here." Comyn went and looked down at the old man who sat in the chair watching him with eyes like 2 dark glowing embers. He said, "You're Jonas Cochrane." The old face, seamed and shriveled and shrunken tight over the characteristic jutting bones, was stamped with a long lifetime of acquired wisdom, none of it saintly. Only that face made it possible to identify this ancient man, wrapped in a shabby woolen robe and dusted with cigarette ash, with the crafty, ruthless schemer of the old days who had clawed top place for his family in the great game of ships and planets. Over his head on the mantel, amid a grotesque ruck of mementos, of baby shoes preserved in bronze, models of the first Cochrane flagships, faded photographs of prosaic Middle Western houses and people, Jonas Cochrane's face was startlingly repeated in a well-done miniature of a Sioux Indian chief. "That's old man afraid of his horses," said Jonas with pride. "On the mother's side, I'm a direct descendant." He went on without any change of tone. "I don't like interference, especially from amateurs. They're unpredictable. You've made us a lot of trouble, Comyn." "Enough trouble," asked Comyn softly, "that you decided to have me killed?" Jonas Cochrane's eyes grew narrow and very bright. "Murder is for fools," he said. "I've never indulged in it. What are you talking about?" Comyn told him. Jonas leaned forward, looking past Comyn. "Are any of you responsible for this? Peter?" Peter snapped. "Of course not. I'll get hold of Hannah." He went out. A couple more people had come in by now, and Comyn thought he could place them. Sidna's other 2 brothers, one strongly resembling Peter but without the iron in him, the other fairer and more round-faced, with a merry, self-indulgent look. There was a gray-haired man with a mouth like a steel trap and a chronically ill-tempered expression, and Comyn knew he was the survivor of Jonas's 2 sons. He could guess the reason for the sour disposition. Old Jonas had lived too long. There were some other 3rd-generation Cochranes, male and female, including the girl who was sitting with Stanley, looking from him to the others with vague alarm and sneaking glances at Comyn as though he might suddenly go off like a bomb. That would be Sidna's cousin. Stanley didn't seem much relieved by the disposal of Ballantyne. He sat staring at his feet, snarling occasionally in a genteel way when his wife whispered to him. Beside them was a middle-aged to elderly woman who looked more like old man afraid of his horses than Jonas did, except that the Sioux chief had a far kindlier face. She looked impatient and said sharply, "Father, Why are we wasting time on this person? I've come all the way up here to discuss business, and I don't see any reason." "Of course you don't," said Jonas tartly. "You're a fool. You always were a fool, Sally. Just sit there and don't bother me." Somebody snickered. Jonas's daughter sprang up. "Father, oh no, Father, I don't have to take that kind of talk, and I won't. Jonas, ignoring her splutter, lighted a cigarette with large hands that were so weak they trembled with the effort. Everyone else seemed amused, except Muffin-Face, who looked distressed. "Don't you mind, Mother?" she whispered timidly. Jonas regarded them both with a great weariness. "Women," he said. Peter Cochrane came back. "Well, Comyn, Hannay says you slugged him and parked him in the washroom, and that's all he knows. He didn't see anyone else following you, nor did he see any attack." Comyn shrugged. "He wouldn't. He was out cold, and the other guy was much better at tailing than Hannay." Stanley said, "We've only got Comyn's word that he ever was attacked." "And Comyn," said Peter, "you hadn't tried to negotiate with anyone, so who would want to silence you? You could have some personal enemies." "Sure," said Comyn, "but this wasn't one of them, and they don't hate me that bad." Stanley shrugged. "How do you know? Anyway, I can't see that it's very important except to you." "Oh, but it is," said old Jonas softly. "You're a fool too, Stanley, or you'd see it. If he's telling the truth, it means that somebody didn't want him to talk to the Cochranes. Somebody preferred to lose Comyn's possible knowledge rather than risk letting us have it. And that means—" He broke off, looking shrewdly at Comyn. "You have courage, but that's a cheap virtue. It's no good without brains. Have you got brains, too? Can you finish my line of reasoning?" "Easy," Comyn answered. "You have been, or are about to be, double-crossed by somebody in your own camp." There was an uproar of voices. Jonas's gray-haired son came to his feet and thrust his face close to Comyn's and shouted, "That statement alone brands you as a liar. No Cochrane would ever sell out." At that, Comyn laughed. Peter's face had taken on a dark, savage look. "I'm afraid I agree with Uncle George. What Comyn implies would presuppose special knowledge on the trader's part, something he knows that we don't know, that he was afraid Comyn might tell us. But there isn't any special knowledge. I examined Ballantyne's ship, the log, everything, and Stanley was with me, and Uncle George and Simon came almost at once." "That's right," said the cheerful young man who was Peter's brother, and who was now more cheerful than he had any business to be. "We were all there together, and nobody else got aboard until we were through. No special knowledge for anybody. Wasn't any. Vouch for old Pete any time. Besides, it's silly. All Cochranes share and share alike." He gave Comyn a slow, gliding look, and Comyn saw that underneath young Simon Cochrane was about as jovial as a cottonmouth. "Personally," he said, "I don't give a damn one way or the other. I'm only interested in finding out whether Paul Rogers is alive or not and bringing him back safe if he is." He faced old Jonas squarely. "There's going to be a second big jump. I want to go along." And that was it. It was funny, he thought, how you kept a crazy idea in your mind, how you told yourself it was crazy and not a thing you'd ever do, and then suddenly you said, "I want to go along," and you knew that all the time you'd been planning to do it. Peter Cochrane said angrily, "You go? What are you, Comyn? The White Knight? If Rogers or any of the other three are alive, we'll bring them back." Comyn shook his head. No dice. The Cochrans have always liked a clear field, and this one is too easy to sweep clean. To put it crudely, I don't trust you." An uproar of voices began, with Sally Cochran's shrill, indignant trumpeting rising above the rest. Old Jonas held up his hand. "Quiet," he said. "All of you." He looked up into Comyn's face with eyes very bright, very hard, as ruthless as an old eagle's. "You'll have to pay for what you want, Comyn. Pay high." "Yeah." The room had become quite still. The light clinking of bracelets was clearly audible as Sally Cochran leaned forward. They all leaned forward, intent on Comyn and the old man, intent on every word. Jonas said, "Ballantyne talked before he died. He talked. But how much, Comyn? How much? Transuranic isn't enough." Jonas hitched himself upward in the chair. He was a gaunt rack of bones with the hot pleasure of combat still burning in it. "And don't try to blackmail me, Comyn. Don't threaten me with United Trade Lines or anyone else. You're here under a glass bubble on the moon, and you can't get out. Understand that? You're here for as long as it suits me, and you can't talk to anyone. This place has come in handy that way before. Now, go on." There was silence in the room, a silence of held breath, and hostile faces, flushed and watching. The palms of Comyn's hands were wet. He was walking a thin wire, and one wrong step would be enough. "No," said Comyn slowly. "Transuranic isn't enough now. You got that much from Ballantyne's own body cells. But there was more." Silence. A ring of eyes around him, hot and hungry, eager and cruel. "Paul Rogers was alive when Ballantyne parted with him. I think the others may have been, too. He pleaded with Paul not to leave him, said he couldn't go back alone." A pale tongue flickered over pale old lips. "He made a landing then. We knew he must have when we found the transuranic elements in his body. Go on, go on." The sound of the drill they were using on the door was what roused Ballantyne, I think. It made him remember other sounds. He spoke about the voyage out. It must have been hell. And then Comyn's flesh began to quiver as he remembered Ballantyne's voice, his face and the look that had been on it. Something or someone was calling to Paul, and Ballantyne was begging him not to listen. Jonas asked harshly, "Who? What?" "Something he called the Transurani. He was afraid of them. I think the others had gone to them, and now Paul was going too. He was afraid of them. He screamed." "And that was all," said Jonas. His eyes were curiously filmed now, like windows curtained lest too much show through. "He was screaming when he died." Comyn's voice was quite natural when he said, "Oh, no, that wasn't all." Silence. He waited. Jonas waited. Too much silence. Comyn thought his own heart was pounding as loud as a kettle drum. He was sure all those straining Cochrane ears heard it and knew he was lying. Suddenly he hated them with a personal hatred. They were too big, too strong, too sure of themselves. They wanted too much. Even if knowledge had come to him at that moment that Paul Rogers and all the others were dead and beyond help, he would have gone on fighting the Cochrans just to mess up their plans. They were too good at using other men for pushballs. And one of them, he was very sure, had tried to kill him. Still, Jonas waited. Comyn smiled. "I'll tell the rest of it," he said, "when I'm out by Barnard's Star." Stanley exploded. "Bluff! Just brazen, stupid bluff. Tell him to go to hell." Uncle George was talking angrily, and Peter tried to get a word in, but the old man in the chair quieted them with 3 words. "Wait a minute." His eyes hadn't left Comyn's. "Wait a minute. There's this to think of. If he isn't bluffing, he could be valuable out there. If he is, even so, it might be best to take him along." They thought that over. They seemed to like it, all but Stanley. Comyn hadn't had to think. He'd got the meaning of it first. He looked at Jonas and he said softly, "You are a tough old so-and-so, aren't you?" Jonas chuckled. "You want to go to Barnard's store, or don't you?" Comyn said between his teeth, "All right, I'll buy it." "You won't," said Jonas, "be going back to Earth." He looked around at the faces. "That goes for all of you but George. Everything's got to be done right here at Luna, and I'll have no babbling it out till we have a second ship on the way." Stanley protested. "But what about the courts? United and Transworld are already entering anti-monopoly suits to get rights to the drive. If they get us tied up—" "They won't," said Jonas. "George and our legal staff can hold them off. Peter, you get things started here. You're in charge." The old man closed his eyes wearily. "Now get out of here, all of you. I'm tired." Comyn found himself with the others out in the big hall. They were dismissed, he thought, savagely, like a lot of school children. But the others paid him no attention. They were talking in high voices, Stanley still protesting, Aunt Sally complaining shrilly, until Peter Cochran's authoritative voice cut across the gabble. "We'd better get started. Since the work has to be done here, we'll need complete machine shop facilities and technical staffs. Nielsen and Felder can handle that. You get them here, Bill. But to put Ballantyne's drive into a new ship just can't be done here," Stanley started. Peter cut him off. "It has to be. One of our new Palace class, I'd say. The locks here will take it. Come on, we'll get things rolling." Comyn turned and walked away from the noisy, argumentative group. He didn't turn when he heard Sidna calling after him. Right now, he'd had enough of the Cochrans. Mixing with the Cochrans had got him into something dandy, something so big that it scared him right down to his boots, and he was in it now, all the way. The corridor was high and empty, and his footsteps mocked him as he walked. He could walk as far as he pleased, through the rooms and halls, across the terraces, around the gardens blooming in the windless air, but he'd still be under this glass bubble on the moon, and death was under it with him. Whoever had tried before would try again now, with effort doubled and redoubled, to make sure that one Arch Comyn with his big mouth never lived to peer at Barnard's star. And if he did live to get there, and they asked him where did Ballantyne land, what was he going to answer? That he didn't know. Chapter 7. Comyn had about reached the limit of his endurance by the time the lid finally blew off everything. He was in the gardens with Sidna under a flowering tree that shadowed them from the green earthlight when the discreet cough of a servant interrupted. "Mr. Peter would like to see you at once, miss." "Is he angry?" asked Sidna. "I'm afraid so, miss. A message came from the yacht." "I thought so," she said, and when the servant was gone, she added, "Well, let him be mad. It was getting too dull here all these weeks." "A nice compliment for me," Comyn remarked. "Oh, Comyn, I didn't mean us. That's been wonderful." "Yeah," he said, "and especially wonderful the way you've let Stanley see us. I appreciate your using me to needle him." He thought she would hit him, but instead, after a moment, she laughed. "He is crazy about you, isn't he?" he demanded. "He's a louse. Because he's crazy about you?" "Because he says so. At least he did once. Just once. Cousin Claudia is a mess, but she is my cousin, and she thinks he's wonderful." She straightened down her white dress. "Look at that, you big ape. You've torn the zipper. And anyway, he's one of those earnest asses that bore me stiff. So I have let him catch us necking a few times." She spoke suddenly with a bitter undertone. "And anyway, Comyn, between us, it's just today. There may not be any tomorrow. When that ship takes off with you inside it, that's it. Shall we go face Peter?" "What have you done now?" "You'll find out. I told you it was getting too dull here." That, Comyn thought grimly as he followed her, was a misstatement. It hadn't been dull here under the dome all these weeks, at least not for him, but it had been wearing, very wearing indeed. The devil of it was that he had had no part whatever in all the feverish, sweating activity that had been going on here. All that work had taken place in the segment of the dome that was completely hidden from the big house by the lines of trees that delimited the gardens. There were the huge locks where freighters came with loads of fuel for the greedy pumps and furnaces, with chemicals for the air purifiers and refrigerants for the daytime cooling system, with water for the vast rock cisterns and tanks of oxygen, with food and liquor and supplies. There were the machine shops that had suddenly and swiftly enlarged so that now a small army of expert mechanics labored in them. There was where the Ballantine Drive was, and the new ship in which it had been installed. It was a larger, stronger, and better ship than Ballantine's, not a pioneer ship, but the follow-up to a pioneer, the Consolidator. The guts had been stripped out of it and been put back in a different pattern. The shops rang with a deafening clangor. Men worked in them right up to the limit of efficiency, and then were replaced by another shift. Nobody complained. Wages were astronomical. The men were prisoners here until after takeoff, but they didn't complain of that either. But they, and Peter Cochrane and Simon and Stanley, were part of something, doing something. Even Uncle George, back on Earth using high-priced legal talent to stave off the anti-monopoly suits, was doing something. Only he, Comyn, was barred out. The armed guards who were stationed beyond the gardens had their orders. A lot of people were posted out, and Comyn was one of them. He could stand and watch the distant silver sides of the ship and the cranes and the atomic welders flaring, could listen to the booming and screeching and hissing, but that was all. "Listen," he told Peter Cochrane, "I'm a work boss and a damned good one, and after all, I'm going in that ship." "Yes," said Peter, "and you get in it when we go. Not before then. We've had proof of your capacities for making trouble, Comyn." "But I could do something outside the ship. I could—" "No, Comyn. You stay out, and that's final. Grandfather's orders." Comyn had stayed out, savagely cursing the old man who remained huddled and unseen in his ridiculous room, plotting to steal a star before he died. He had watched from outside when the ship went out on its first test, slipping silently up into the stark lunar sky. He felt a cold qualm in the belly when he realized that presently he would be inside that same ship, inside a tiny, tiny capsule that held all the light and air and life there was out in the black immensities between the suns. He had had to wait and watch and sweat until the ship slipped back and Peter Cochrane came out of it. His face was beaded with sweat and drawn with impatience and something else. Stanley walked jerkily behind him. "Whole robot shift for the drive had bugs in it. The relays won't take the load. Rip it out and rebuild it." That was all Comyn could find out, just what he overheard. And he was supposed to sit and wait and play games with Sidna and be patient, and he was about ready to blow his fuses one way or another. only it seemed that Sidna had blown hers first. He followed her up to the house, and he was sure from the stubborn set of her chin that she was heading into a storm. Peter was waiting for her on the terrace. He wore the blackest look Comyn had ever seen on a man's face. Stanley and Claudia were there, too, as well as a brace of young cousins who looked brightly expectant. Peter said flatly, "The yacht's due to land in 20 minutes. Captain Moore radioed for clearance because he's worried. It seems, Sidna, that there are some 20-odd of your friends aboard." She said brightly, "Oh, I forgot to tell you about that. I thought a party would liven things up around this detention home." Peter let go. "You know what we're trying to do here. You know how much a lot of people would give to know what we're doing. Yet you—" "Don't be so stuffy, Pete. None of my friends are spies. They don't have brains enough. And anyway, they don't care." "Sure, laugh it off," he said furiously. "Listen, what do you think would happen if word got out that we have a second starship almost ready to go? They'd slap an injunction on us in an hour. The only thing that's saved us so far is the fact they don't suspect how fast we're moving. Damn it, Sidna!" "Stop swearing at me and cool down. Your guards will keep them out of the work locks. Nobody'll go there anyway if the liquor's here at the house." "A party would be nice," said Claudia timidly. Then she looked at Stanley and shut up. Stanley said, "Tell the yacht to go back to Earth." He had aged a good bit since Comyn had first seen him. He had lost that pink, well-fed look, and there was a taut intensity about him that almost matched Peter's. He, too, was going on the second big jump. He had insisted on it, and Sally Cochran had backed him, averring that somebody had to look after her and Claudia's interests. But he didn't seem to enjoy the prospect. "It can't go back," Sidna said. "People would know something was up here if you sent them all back now." She had them licked, and they knew it. Peter snarled, "All right, Sidna. But if anything goes wrong, I swear I'll break your neck." Nothing went wrong. Not at first. The yacht landed, and from a distance, Comyn saw a crowd of gay, squealing young fools pour out of it and make for the house and Sidna and the liquor. And it seemed that almost at once the earthlit gardens and terraces were full of laughter and dance music and white-jacketed men carrying trays of drinks. Comyn sat on a terrace and had a few, and a few more, and listened to people having fun. He wasn't having any, not at all. He wasn't sober, but he couldn't let go any more. He knew why, too. It was because he wasn't quite one of the normal humankind anymore, because the shadow of the coming big jump was on him, because presently he was going away from it all, out where only 5 men had ever been before, toward something that could rob you even of a decent death. He wondered for the 1,000th time what Ballantyne had meant by the Trans-Uranie. How could you guess what a thing was when there wasn't any frame of reference at all to go on? They had talked about the Trans-Uranie, but nobody had really had anything to say that could help. The Trans-Uranie, whoever, whatever they were, was it they who had done the thing to Ballantyne that— Comyn shivered and poured down a little more of the Cochran's good whiskey to drown out the sight and sound of Ballantyne, dead and stirring in his high-barred bed. All of a sudden, a pretty girl with dark fluffy hair was standing in front of him, asking, "Who are you?" She was cute as a button. She made him feel old, and suddenly there was an uncrossable gulf between them because of the thing he was going to do, and that she was not going to do and didn't even know about. But she was cute. "I don't know," he said. "I'm a stranger here, myself. Who are you?" "You'll never guess." "Then I won't try." "I'm Bridget," she said, and made a face. "Awful name, isn't it?" All at once she brightened, looking over Comyn's head. "Oh, there's Simon." She called his name and waved, and Simon came over and put his arm around her, and she sort of melted in against him, smiling, but still interested in Comyn. "Simon, he's unhappy. Why is he unhappy?" "He thinks people are trying to kill him. Has anybody tried it lately, Comyn?" "I haven't turned my back on anybody," Comyn said. "You're joking," said Bridget. "Nobody would want to kill him. He's cute." "Well," said Simon, "that's a word I wouldn't have thought of to describe him, but maybe you're right. Come on, Bridgie. So long, Comyn, and don't take any poisoned martinis." Comyn watched them go. His lack of affection for Simon Cochran was reaching gigantic proportions. He was thinking how nice it was going to be for all of them, cooped up together in a ship all the way out to Barnard's Star. He saw Peter come out on the terrace and stand scowling at the festivities. He was stone-cold sober. Stanley joined him, and he wasn't having any fun either. They talked a minute or two, and then Peter went down into the garden and vanished into the darkness. Going to check on his cordon of guards, Comyn thought. Sidna ought to get a good licking for this. But then it was just such a trick of Sidna's that had got him here, so he ought to be grateful. Or ought he? Where was Sidna anyway? Stanley went down the steps and into the garden after Peter. Comyn got up. He was tired of sitting and brooding. He searched around for a sight of Sidna's blonde head, spotted it, and went toward it. The terrace felt a bit unsteady under his feet, and there seemed to be 200 or 300 people on it instead of only some 20-odd. Sidna was with the long drink of water she called Johnny, the one Comyn had met before. There were several others around them. Somebody had just said something very funny, and they were all laughing. Comyn came up beside Sidna and said, "Hello." She looked up at him. Her eyes were very bright, very gay. "Hello, Comyn." On the other side of her, Johnny stood up. Comyn said, "How about entertaining a visiting fireman?" She shook her head. "You look glum." "I don't feel like being glum." She turned away. Comyn put his hand on her shoulder. "Sidna." "Oh, go away, Comyn. I'm enjoying myself. Let me alone." Johnny stepped between them. He was feeling good. He was feeling strong and twice his normal size. He thrust his face into Comyn's and said, "You heard her. Go away." Comyn's temper, none too long at the best, ran out with a snap. He picked Johnny up and set him aside. "Listen, Sidna, I want to talk to you." Johnny's fist hit him on the cheekbone, hard enough to make his head ring. "Now, will you go?" asked Johnny. His breath was coming hard and excited, and he was all ready to let her go again. Sidna sprang to her feet, slamming her glass down on the low table in front of her. "Oh, the devil with both of you!" she snapped, and strode away, taking the others with her. Comyn glowered after her, thinking that some day he would beat that arrogance out of her if he kept his health. Johnny said, "I think we'd better go out in the garden." Comyn looked at him. "Oh, no." Johnny's face was pale, except for 2 red bars along his cheekbones. He had worked himself up to a fine pitch, and he wasn't going to let it go. "You've been trying to take Sidna away from me," he said. Comyn laughed. The red bars widened on Johnny's face until they reached from his collar to the roots of his hair. "You come into the garden," he said, "or I'll do it right here." He would, too, Comyn sighed. "Okay, Junior, come on. Maybe I can talk some sense into you out there." They went down the steps, close together. There was a rustling and cooing as of pigeons in the dark fringe of shrubbery, and Comyn led on. Johnny trampled beside him, his breath whistling in his nose. Comyn grinned. Johnny sounded like a very young and angry bull at courting time. The light of the terrace dimmed and passed away behind them, and the stars grew very bright, burning against the dome. The voices were only a distant murmur. Johnny said, "This is far enough." "Okay," Comyn stopped. "Hold on a minute, kid, and listen." He ducked, and Johnny's arm swung violently past his head. Then the kid was all over him. Comyn smacked him open-handed a couple of times, impatiently, but the kid was full of himself. He was strong enough, and some of his blows hurt. Comyn began to get mad. "Lay off," he said, "or I'll give it to you, kid or no kid." He pushed him away. Johnny muttered something about Comyn being scared to fight. Suddenly he rushed him. Comyn sidestepped. From out of the dense shadows of a stand of tall, white-flowering bushes came a narrow bolt of lightning. It struck with a crack and a flare on the spot which Comyn had just left and which Johnny was just now passing. The kid went down without a whimper. Comyn stood for one dazed instant, looking from the dead boy to the dark mass of bushes. Then he moved, faster than he had ever moved before. A second bolt from a shocker turned up to lethal voltage hit the ground behind him. It knocked him over, half-stunned, but that was all, and he never stopped going, rolling in among a clump of trees. He got his own weapon into his hand and pushed the stud all the way up and fired into the bushes, but a little high. He wanted to flush the killer out, alive. Sounds began to come from the direction of the house. They had seen the man-made lightning playing. Some woman screamed, and men were shouting. Comyn fired twice more into the bushes, changing his position fast each time. The killer didn't answer, and then, beyond the bushes, he heard somebody running. Comyn went after him. People were pouring out into the gardens from the house now. The killer couldn't turn that way. He could try to double back toward the passenger lock, but Comyn would be in his way, and Comyn was armed. Maybe the killer hadn't counted on this. He went the only way there was left open, toward the freight locks. Comyn ran, turning down the power on his shocker. It didn't carry far that way, but if he could get close enough, he might bring down the guy alive and still able to talk. He saw him running fast across an open glade. He shouted to him to stop, but he was outranged. The only answer he got was a snap bolt that hit a tree too close for comfort. There were shouts and thrashings in the gardens all around now, and the emergency lights were coming on. The guards were moving in from the freight locks. The killer ran, but there was no place to run to. And then there were men on all sides of him in the bright glare of the lights, and the blue bolts flashed and struck, and that was it. Comyn came up. There was a milling around of people. Guards were shoving the workmen back into the lock, and there was a lot of talking. Peter Cochrane and Stanley were both there, both with shockers in their hands, looking at the body. Comyn looked too. "Do you know him?" he asked. Peter nodded, and Stanley said, "Name's Washburn. He used to be a Cochrane employee, 2-3 years ago. He was fired. Undesirable, a troublemaker." Stanley shook his head. "How did he get here? What was he doing?" Comyn said, "Trying to kill me. He tried it once before on Earth." Peter looked at him sharply. "You're sure of that?" Comyn nodded. People were coming from the party now. Sidna Simon, guests looking excited, frightened, upset, or curious according to their natures. "Keep them back," said Peter savagely. "Keep them away from here." Comyn said, "It doesn't matter now. You might as well let them see the ship. It doesn't matter." Peter stared at him. Simon moved between them, looking down. "Hey," he said. "Hey, he came aboard the yacht. I saw him." Peter's eyes blazed. "And you didn't stop him? You let a character like that come in here and didn't even tell me?" Simon said angrily. "Are you kidding? He had a pass from you." Without a word, Comyn turned and took Peter Cochrane by the neck and bore him down. Hands pulled at him. There was a lot of confusion of voices. Finally, somebody hit him across the back of the head with the flat of a shocker. He let go, and they dragged him away, off of Peter. Peter got up unsteadily. Stanley was down on his knees beside the dead man, going through his pockets. He held up a piece of paper. "Here it is, Peter. It has your signature." Peter shook his head. He took the paper and studied it. "Forgery. He worked for us. He could have got hold of a signature very easily. Probably on his termination of contract papers. I've signed a lot of them. I never gave him a pass." Comyn said, "I hope you can prove that." Men were still holding his arms, and his head hurt. Peter Cochrane came up to him. "Why? And what did you mean by—" "Let them see the ship. It doesn't matter now." Comyn said slowly, "Your friend was in too much of a hurry. He thought he had had a clear shot at me, but he didn't. Johnny got in the way." A silence fell. It spread outward from Comyn, stunned and heavy, and in it Sidney's voice was harsh and very loud. "You mean Johnny's dead?" "Dead. You can bury Washburn, and you could have buried me, but you can't bury Johnny. And I'm glad. He was a fool kid, but this wasn't any of his fight. There was no reason he should die for it." He looked around at them, at Peter and Simon and Bill Stanley, and at Sidney with her shocked white face, particularly at Sidney. "Well, you had your party," he said bitterly, "and it's blown the lid right off your private country on the moon. You'll have Earth policemen tramping all over it, and you can't keep them out. They'll want to know all about how Johnny got killed, and why, and what you're doing here that's worth a murder, and there won't be any secret about it anywhere. That's why I say you might as well let them know about the ship." Again there was a long, cold silence. The dead man lay on his side where Stanley had rolled him, one arm flung carelessly across his face. His mouth seemed to be smiling as if he were dreaming. Stanley looked gray and sick, and Simon's eyes roved uneasily, not looking at anything. Behind the people, the freight locks towered upward, and out from them came the muffled clang and roar that hadn't stopped even for death. Peter Cochrane spoke. "I will notify the Earth authorities myself. Meanwhile, no one is to leave the dome or communicate with anyone until the investigation is complete and the police allow you to go." There was a loud cry of protest. Peter silenced it. "I'm sorry, it's necessary. You are welcome as our guests, and I'm sure Sidney will make your visit as pleasant as possible." They began to straggle away slowly, back toward the house. Some men went to hunt for Johnny. Peter turned again to Comyn. "I haven't tried to kill you. As Jonas told you, murder is for fools. And if I had wanted to kill you, I'd have done it myself, and it wouldn't have been bungled. All right, boys, let him go." Then Peter Cochrane went off, walking fast, toward the freight locks. Simon watched him go uneasily. "You know what he'll do?" he said to Stanley. Stanley was still staring at the body. It seemed to have a strange fascination for him. He ran his tongue constantly over his lips as though they were dry, and his hands shook. "I don't know," he answered absently. "I haven't had time to think. He'll hold off notifying Earth as long as he can. He'll get the bloody ship ready for takeoff and go without any further tests. By the time the cops get here, we'll be clear out of the system. If the drive works." His voice lingered over the brief word, if. Comyn heard him and shivered, wondering where they would be if it didn't. Chapter 8. His name was Arch Comyn, and once he had had a home on Earth, and once he had had a girl with strong brown shoulders. And what was he doing out here in the abyss between the stars? From across the main cabin, from the table where some of the others were playing cards, a voice said, "Give me 3." Comyn thought it was funny. It was very funny indeed that men making the second big jump in history, that men going faster and farther than any men but 5 had ever gone before, separated only by metal walls from the awfulness of infinity, should sit and play games with little plastic cards and pretend that they were not where they were. He knew now what Ballantyne had felt. This was not the going between worlds that men had grown used to. This was an adventure into madness. The ports were shielded tight because there was nothing beyond them but an awful blankness, tinged with eerie flickerings of energy that was their own mass discharging itself through the neutronic converters into a tight propulsion field, hurling them through a space that was not normal and might not even exist in their own universe. Theoretically, the astrogators knew where they were. Actually, no one knew. The nastiest thing about it was that there was no sense of motion. The interior of the ship was gripped in a stasis that was the reactionless core of the mass propulsion field itself, the dead quiet eye of the hurricane. They might as well have been in a tightly shuttered room on Earth, going nowhere. And yet the stars that Ballantyne had learned to hate, showed on the screens as crawling tracks, distorted and spectral and infinitely strange as the unthinkably speeding ship overtook and passed their light rays. Only one screen, fitted with a complicated electronic damper field, showed space ahead in relatively true perspective. Centered in the crosshairs and kept centered by automatic compensators was the dull red eye of Barnard's star. At first, the men had stared often at the screen and the brooding eye in it. Then they had looked at it less and less and finally avoided it altogether. Comyn couldn't avoid it. He'd gone back to stare at it again and again. He couldn't stop thinking about it. He asked Peter Cochrane now, "Why Barnard's star, anyway? What made Ballantyne pick it instead of Centauri?" "We knew Barnard's star has planets," said Peter. He looked worn, drawn to the breaking point, full of a feverish triumph that wouldn't let him rest. "It has a low luminosity, and the astronomers were able to separate its planets visually some years ago with the Keeble telescope. Alpha and Proxima Centauri they're still not sure of, so Barnard was chosen. Of course, it's only a start. The Wiseacre theory is pretty well proved by now, and it postulates that most stars have planets. So you can see this is only a start." He broke off suddenly as though he realized he was talking too rapidly, too intensely. The young doctor who had cared for Ballantyne and who was going to take care of them now because he was the only expert there was on transuranic medicine, said, "Better take a sedative and knock off for a while, Mr. Cochrane," Peter said. "No, I want to go over those logbooks again." "There's plenty of time for logbooks." "There's nothing in them we haven't already found out anyway," Simon said. His gaze, cold and glowering, was fixed on Comyn. "Our friend here is the only one who knows where we're going. Or does he?" "You'll find out," said Comyn, "when we get there." French, the doctor, and Roth, the physicist who had examined Ballantyne, and the other men from the Cochrane labs who were playing cards, bent studiously over their game to keep out of Cochrane quarrels. Comyn said harshly to Peter, Simon, and Bill Stanley, "And before you find out, I'm going to know which of you hired Washburn to do me in." "Which of us?" "Yes. It was one of you 3. One of you has the missing books of Ballantyne's log. You all had the opportunity." Comyn's eyes were very bright, very hard. He was like the rest of them, suffering from long tension. Things had been bad before they left Luna. Johnny's sheeted corpse lying in one of the great rooms, Sidna's guests hysterically demanding to know why the police didn't come, why they were being kept prisoners, and Sidna herself with a face like a stone image, not speaking to anyone. Old Jonas had talked to her. What he had said, Comyn didn't know, but Sidna had no spirit left in her. It hadn't really gone on long, no more than 2 days, Earth time. Peter had done exactly as Simon predicted. The activity around the freight locks had reached an insane pitch, with workmen dropping in their tracks and being revived or replaced, and then, incredibly, the ship was ready. Peter called the authorities, and there wasn't even time to say goodbye. "One of you," Comyn said, "hired that killer who got the wrong man. I'm not sure yet which one of you it was, but I will be." Peter said furiously, "You still think I gave Washburn that pass?" "He had it." Simon came and stood in front of Comyn. "I didn't like you the first time I saw you," he said. "I like you less and less as time goes by. You talk too much. It might be a good idea if someone did kill you." "Yeah," said Comyn, "and you saw Washburn get off the yacht. You could have stopped him and checked that forged pass, but you didn't." Bill Stanley caught Simon's arm and said, "Wait a minute. We can't afford any brawls now. Dr. French cleared his throat nervously. Listen, we're under a psychological strain that can crack us wide open if we're not careful. Knock it off. Take a sedative. Calm down. Especially you, Mr. Cochran." "You sound," said Peter dryly, "as though you could use a sedative yourself." He glanced at Simon. "However, I think you're right. Let it go, Simon." "You'd better let it go, too. But I won't argue it now. I'm going to try to sleep." He went off to his cabin. Simon had disappeared. Bill Stanley sat down by himself and stared blankly at a bulkhead. The card players talked in low monotones, not as though their minds were on the game. Comyn lit a cigarette and moved restlessly back and forth in the confined space. Air whirred in the ventilators, the dome lights burned, and they were bright enough, but there was something vaguely unnatural about the light itself, as though it had shifted somewhere along the spectrum. Comyn's flesh quivered deep in its individual cells, torturing him like a persistent itch. It tortured everybody. Roth had said it was some obscure effect of the stasis and its surrounding field of energy. Static electricity, he thought, generated by their own bodies under the abnormal conditions. One of the hazards of starflight. It could be a hazard. Little things could grow so big. Little things like an itch or a sound you couldn't quite hear. Comyn thought, Ballantyne heard it at the last. All the way out to Barnard's Star and back he listened to it, but he couldn't hear it. And then they fetched the damn electric drill, and that was it, the sound. Just over the threshold of hearing lay the nerve-aching screech and whine, the incessant, maddening, unbearable sound, the sound of the drive. Comyn swore abruptly and said, "It wouldn't be so bad if we were moving." Roth grunted, scowling at the cards he held. "You're moving," he said. "You're covering 6 light-years a lot of times faster than light itself." He threw down his hand. "A lousy pair of 10s. I'm out." "Yes, Comyn, you're moving." "But how do we know we are? We can't feel it. We can't see it. We can't even hear it." "We take it on faith," said Roth. "Our instruments assure us that we're approaching Barnard's Star at high velocity, or it's approaching us. Who knows? Motion is only relative. Anyway, relative to our known universe, we're going at a speed that's so fast it's impossible, theoretically. Relative to some other universe or state of matter, we could easily be standing still." "When you scientists start dreaming it up, you give me a pain," said Comyn. "It all sounds cockeyed." "Not at all. Groom's theory, on which Ballantyne built his drive, was that the so-called light-speed barrier was real, and that matter achieving faster-than-light velocities would shift into another plane of atomic vibration, or matter state, creating a closed vacuum in the continuum in which energy could be neither gained nor lost. Hence the mass propulsion field, the ship feeding on itself, as it were, using the kinetic energy stored up in the original acceleration. The drive works, but whether or not that proves the theory, we don't know. There's a very interesting distortion of time." Comyn, listening and only half understanding, felt that nightmare sense of unreality closer upon him. He fought against it. He had to keep his mind on the very real and nasty problem that faced Arch Comyn. "And Vickery was much concerned with time in his notes on the outward voyage," Roth was saying. "The chronometers functioned, but were they still accurate as to Earth chronology? There was no way to check. We say they took so-and-so many months for the first jump. Vickery's word was eternity, a fairly vague term. How long has it been since we went into Star Drive? My idea is that the time sense—" Comyn stamped out his cigarette irritably and left the main cabin. All this scientific double-talk was upsetting. He had a literal mind. A chair was a chair, a table was a table, and an hour was 60 minutes long. As long as he could hang on to these realities, he could make out. He dug a bottle out of a locker, not the sedative Dr. French would have prescribed, but 90 proof and good enough. He sat drinking it and thinking of Sidna, wondering if she really meant what she had said about there not being any tomorrow for them. Probably. He wished she was here, but he was glad she wasn't. After a while, he began to listen to the drive, the sound he could hear with the edges of his teeth and the raw ends of his nerves, but not quite with his ears. He swore, poured another drink, and then went to sleep. It seemed a devil of a way to spend your time on this, man's second traverse between the stars, but there wasn't much else to do. Even the scientists had little to do but check their instruments. The flight engineers were useful only when shifting in or out of drive, and the pilots were purely ornamental except when the ship was operating on normal velocity. The functioning of the ship on Star Drive was automatic. No crew of human beings could have controlled it manually. All they did was sit and watch a million gadgets and hope they worked. Comyn snored, twitched, and dreamed. His dreams were not good. He started up, gagging on a lungful of stale air. It seemed to him that he hadn't breathed real air since he went to Luna, and became aware of the bell that announced mealtime. Comyn came out of his cabin warily, as he always did. He was not afraid of guns. The ship's arsenal was locked, and no one was allowed anything more lethal than a pocket knife. Peter Cochrane was taking no chances with hysteria, space fever, or simple mutiny. But a man bent on murder can be very ingenious in devising weapons. Comyn was cautious. There was no one in the corridor. Comyn yawned and started along it toward the main cabin. His head was still heavy, and there was a strong taste of whiskey in his mouth. On the starboard side of the corridor was a compartment used for the keeping of certain stores for the cabin section. The door was not quite shut, but that was not unusual since people went in and out of it fairly often. Comyn passed it. There was a swift, sharp suction of air behind him. A door behind pulled open silently but very fast, and then a hurried step and one harsh, indrawn breath. Comyn threw himself forward and as much to the left as he could manage on split-second notice. The steel bar that had been meant for the back of his skull came whistling down onto his right shoulder instead. It made a very ugly noise. Pain became a huge, inescapable fact. He was falling, and he couldn't help that, but his left hand went instinctively to the focal point of that agony as though to hold it back, and found instead the collared end of the steel bar, and gripped it and pulled it along. He hit the deck. Bands of light were flickering in front of his eyes, and there was darkness close behind. But the fear of death was on him, and he thrashed around, still holding the steel bar. There was a man there, a cautious man, a man expecting failure because he had hidden his face and head so that his victim could not recognize him. All this care, despite the fact that there should have been no possibility of recognition. Rage came up in Comyn so strongly that it almost cleared away that gathering dark. He made an animal sound with no words in it and tried to get up. The man with the hidden face turned suddenly and ran away. His legs and his polished shoes ran down the length of the passage, and Comyn watched them, and he knew whose shoes they were, and he recognized those dark-trousered legs. A man's face is only part of what you know him by. He started to say the name that went with them, but he didn't have time. He passed out. He was still lying in the corridor, his right arm was numb to the finger ends, and he felt pain when he moved. It took him a long time to get up, and a longer time to make the several miles down the passage and into the main cabin. He hadn't been out too long. They were still at dinner around the collapsible tables. The men looked at him when he came in. They were all there, Peter and Simon and Bill Stanley, the scientists, all of them. They stopped eating, and Dr. French got up suddenly. Comyn sat down heavily. He looked at Peter Cochrane. "I'm ready now," he said, "to tell you where Ballantyne landed." Chapter 9. Many voices spoke at once. French was bending over him, asking where he was hurt. Peter Cochrane stood up, demanding silence. Simon was leaning forward, his eyes intent. Bill Stanley put down his knife and fork. His hands were seized with an uncontrollable trembling. There was a pallor on him and a sweating. Comyn laughed. "You should have made it good," he said to William Stanley. "Peter would have. Simon would have. But not you. You haven't that kind of guts," Stanley said. "I don't—" "Oh, yes, you do. Hiding your face didn't hide the rest of you. I know your shoes, your clothes, the way you move. I know you now." Stanley pushed his chair back a little, as though he would like to get away from Comyn, from all of them. He spoke again, but his words were not clear. "It's different when you have to do it yourself, isn't it?" Comyn said. "Not nice and tidy like just writing a check. You have to figure on maybe missing the first time. You have to be able to go on hitting a man until he stays down. You have to have a strong stomach and no nerves like Washburn. Maybe with a gun you could have done it, but not with your hands. Not ever with your hands." French was trying to peel his shirt back, and Comyn pushed him away. Simon had risen. His eyes met Peter's. Peter's face got white around the lips. Suddenly he took hold of Stanley's jacket. "Did you do this, Bill?" Stanley sat perfectly still, looking up at Peter. His eyes began to get a slow, hot gleam in them that grew brighter and uglier, and then, all at once, he struck Peter's hand away and sprang up. It seemed as though that rough touch on him had acted as a key to turn loose everything that had been bottled up in him under pressure for a long time. It came out quietly, very quietly, as though his throat was pulled too tight to make much noise in it. "Yes, I did. And keep your hands off me." He moved back a step or two, away from them. Nobody spoke around the tables. They were all watching, with their forks halfway to their mouths. Simon started forward, but Peter caught him. "That won't do any good right now," he said, and then to Stanley, "You have the logbooks." "I had them. I burned them." He looked from Peter to Simon and back again. "Getting them was easy. You were all so excited, thinking what you might be going to get. There were only 2 of them, thin little books. I saw them first and stuck them inside my shirt, as easy as that." "You burned them," Peter said, and Stanley jerked his head. "I memorized them. I have a good memory." He turned on Comyn. "All right, go ahead. Tell them. You've made trouble for me from the beginning. I'd have had you killed on Mars, only Peter stopped it." Comyn said, "Doesn't Johnny weigh a little heavy on your soul?" "No, that was Washburn's doing. I didn't even know he was there until I saw him dead. I fired him after he failed the first time. You cost him a lot of money, Comyn, and he was mad. I guess he thought he could still collect. Probably blackmail me, too. No, Johnny wasn't my fault." "I don't understand, Bill," said Peter. He was staring at Stanley in a puzzled way, shaking his head slowly from side to side. "Why? We always treated you right. You were one of the family. You had an important job, plenty of money. We trusted you. I don't understand." Stanley laughed. It was not a nice sound. "One of the family," he repeated. "An appendage. A wailing wall for Claudia and a football for her mother. A convenience. Good old dependable Bill. But not a Cochran, never for a minute. No real voice in anything, no real interest in the corporation. That was all Claudia's." His mouth twisted. "Claudia," Simon said angrily. "What did you marry her for, then? You were anxious enough at the time." "What would anybody marry Claudia for?" asked Stanley. "Her money. I thought I could stick it out, but between her and her old bat of a mother—" He broke off. "All right. I saw a chance to get hold of something worth having, and I took it. What's wrong with that? Ask old Jonas how many times he did it, to get his palace on the moon." Comyn repeated his original statement about himself. "You should have made it good." "I should have. Unfortunately, I don't have the capacity for violence. Few civilized men do." His control was beginning to crack a little. He had started to shake again, and his eyes blazed. Comyn thought how unfamiliar a man looked with all his emotions showing. It was like seeing him with his clothes off. Stanley turned again to Peter and the smoldering Simon. His voice had risen just a little, a notch higher, a notch louder. "Comyn says he can tell you where Ballantyne landed. All right. But I read the log, remember? I know the coordinates, not just the world, but the exact location on it. I know where the transuranic ores are, the exact location. I know—" Peter said, "I think we could find them if we had to." "Perhaps you could. But there's more than just finding them. There's the transurani. I know about them, too." He strode toward Comyn 4 or 5 jerky steps. "Do you know all that, Comyn? Can you tell them?" Comyn didn't answer for a long moment. Then he said slowly, "Stanley, you're a scared little man. A greedy little man, and you're hoping against hope. But you're safe. You win." He glanced at Peter. "I thought maybe I could jar it out of him, but it didn't work. I can't tell you where Ballantyne landed. I never knew." Peter let out a long breath. "I hoped," he said, "but I never counted on it. So that settles that." He looked at Stanley. "Well?" Stanley was trying hard to hang on to himself. The sudden uncontested victory had almost unmanned him. He tried 3 times before he could get the words out. "Let's not be polite about this. For once I've got the upper hand, and there's nothing you can do about it. You can't even kill me, because all the knowledge is in my head, and because you're going to need me every step of the way, before we land and after, especially after." "Suppose," said Peter softly, "that we decide we don't need you at all. Suppose we just lock you up and let you stay there." "You could. It would be dangerous and tremendously expensive to search 8 unknown planets. There are satellites, too, you know. Our fuel and supplies aren't unlimited. The voyage alone was Ballantyne's whole objective, and the landing was only by the way. But we're here to consolidate, and we can't waste too much potential running around." You could try, and you might even succeed. But without the information I can give you, you'd never get the oars. You probably wouldn't even survive the attempt. There are obstacles." The shadow of dread that passed over Stanley's face was more impressive than any threat, because it was personal and unpremeditated, and Comyn was remembering Ballantyne's final scream. "What's your price?" asked Peter Cochrane. "High," said Stanley, "but not too high. I want a controlling interest in Cochrane Transuranic and all that goes with it. 51%. You Cochranes have enough, Peter. There's no reason why you should have this, too." For a while nobody spoke. There were deep lines between Peter's eyes and around his mouth. Simon watched Stanley with the cold eagerness of a leopard. Finally, Peter said, "What do you think, Simon?" "Tell him where to go. The Cochranes have never needed help from little swine like him." Again no one spoke. Peter scowled and thought. Sweat gathered in drops on Stanley's forehead and ran slowly down his temples, over pulses that were beating visibly. Peter said thoughtfully, "We might beat it out of him." His gaze slid to Comyn. "What do you think?" "I'd enjoy it," Comyn said. "But it's risky business. None of us are experts, and you can kill a man without meaning to. Besides, in this case it wouldn't work. All Stanley has to do is break down and tell us a bunch of lies, and we wouldn't know the difference. We couldn't check it." He paused and added, "I think he's got you." Simon started a bitter protest, and Peter silenced him. "It comes down to this," he said. 100% or 49. It won't make any difference if we come back the way Ballantyne did." "Very well, Bill. You win." "I want it on paper," Stanley said, "and signed." "You'll get it. And now I'm going to tell you what I think of you." He told him, and Stanley listened. When he was all through, Stanley said, "You are entitled to that. But I don't want any more of it from either of you, do you understand?" He seemed to have grown several inches taller, and his face had acquired a superficial calm that was almost dignified. He started to leave the cabin, a proud man, a successful man, and then Comyn said quietly, "Do you think this is going to make Sidna fall at your feet?" Stanley turned around. He said, "I don't know why I didn't beat your head in when I had the chance. You keep your dirty mouth shut." "What is this?" demanded Peter. "About Sidna?" Comyn said, "He'd rather have her than Claudia." Simon laughed. He seemed to find that idea so genuinely funny that he couldn't help laughing. Stanley rounded on him in a white fury. "Sidna's standards aren't so high. Ask Comyn. And you're going to learn something, all of you. You're going to learn to respect me. Sidna, too. She has nothing to be haughty about except her money. None of you have. You can all think what you like about me, but by God, you'll respect me." He gave Simon a crack across the mouth that stopped his laughter, and then he went away so swiftly and furiously that he was gone before Simon could get at him. Peter hauled his brother away toward his own cabin. "Keep your temper," he said. "We've got enough on our necks. Come on, we have work to do." They left. The men around the table began slowly to eat again, not as though they cared about it. They didn't talk. They were too embarrassed by what had happened, and now waited till they could get off by themselves in small groups to let loose the excited chatter that was in them. French said to Comyn, "Better let me take care of that shoulder." He took care of it, and it was not as bad as it might have been because Comyn's muscles were thick and had saved the bone. But he was pretty well laid up with it for a while. By the time he could use his arm again, he was ready to lose his mind from inaction, from the subliminal screech of the drive, from the not moving and not seeing, the uncanny drawing out of time. He looked at his watch, and it meant nothing. The chronometers were only a mockery. Earth was years, centuries behind them, and Barnard's star had grown no bigger on the screen, no brighter. The feeling had begun to grow on the ship's company that they were lost somewhere out of space and time and would never find their way back. There were outbreaks of hysteria, and French was busy with his needle. One man cracked completely and was confined to his cabin, strapped down. "We'll all be there," muttered French, "if we don't get out of this pretty soon." "We're almost ready to shift drive," Peter said. His face was pared down to the bone now, and he looked more like Jonas and more like an Indian than ever. "We'll be back in normal space tomorrow." He hesitated before he said that word that was only an arbitrary symbol for something that didn't exist. If we make it, Comyn thought. The fear was in him, too. It was the strangeness that got you, the not knowing. You had to sit and wait and wonder if the trap would let you go. Stanley kept saying, "Don't worry. Ballantyne and the others felt the way we do. But they came out of it all right. They made it." He had his paper, signed and sealed. He knew more about what was going to happen than any of them, but even he was afraid. It showed on him like a gray dust, and his cheering words were only words and nothing more. Nobody answered him. People rarely spoke to him anymore. Comyn thought that it wasn't their concern over the Cochrane fortunes, but simply that the men hated to have their lives depending on Stanley. They didn't trust him, not because of his business ethics, but because they felt he was not a man, except by courtesy of sex. He was no longer pink and prosperous, but he was still the executive errand boy, the carrier out of other men's orders. They had seen the way he had won his victory. It did not inspire confidence in them. "As soon as we're out of drive," Stanley told Peter, "I'll give you the coordinates on our destination." The flight engineers were glued to their instruments now. Time passed, or the arbitrary illusion of it, measured off by the chronometers. Men moved about, doing nothing in particular with great intensity, or simply sat and sweated. They had been through this once, and it had been bad enough. This time it was worse. The interior of the ship felt to Comyn like the inside of a bomb getting ready to explode. The red eye of Barnard's star watched them from the screen and didn't change. The dome lights began to flash off and on. Alarm bells rang through the passageways and in the cabins, the first warning. French finished giving the last man his shot. "All right," said Peter. "Everybody to your quarters." His voice was rasping like an old man's. Up in the control room, the pilots were strapping in, ready to take over. Indicators quivered and crawled, and a sonic relay beam was squeaking higher and higher up the scale. Lights flickered on the board like little stars. The engineers were as robots, eyes fixed, faces glazed with sweat, calling off in voices that weren't human. The astrogators were standing by. Somebody said, "What if they miscalculated? What if we ram right into Barnard's star?" Comyn went back to his cabin and lay down. He felt sick. He wanted a drink worse than he ever had in his life, but there wasn't any more. He rolled the coppery taste of fear over his tongue and braced himself. The dome lights were still flashing off, on, off, on. The bells rang. Second warning. Comyn waited. The shot was supposed to dull the nerves, make the shock easier on them. He didn't feel dulled. He was afraid of what was coming and more afraid of its not coming. Suppose the drive failed to shift. Suppose they couldn't come out of it. The dome lights flashed, off, on. It was hard on the eyes, hard on the nerves. The squall and screech of the drive was almost audible now. He waited, and it was a long time. Too long. Something had gone wrong. The drive had failed, and they couldn't come out of it. They were going to go on and on forever in this not space until they went crazy and died, and even that wouldn't stop them. The lights stopped flashing. They stayed a hard, bright, steady glare, and then the third warning sounded. Not bells this time, but a siren, so there would be no mistake about it. The wild banshee howling raised the hair on Comyn's head and brought out the cold sweat on his skin, and then the lights went out and there was no more sound. Darkness, the black silence of the tomb. He strained his ears, but even the supersonic torture of the drive was slipping away, receding beyond reach. Blue witch lights flared from every metal surface in the ship, and then it began. The subtle slide and wrench and twist that took each separate atom in a man's body and moved it in a new direction with the most horrible effect of vertigo that had ever been devised. Comyn tried to scream, but whether he made it or not he never knew. For one timeless, ghastly interval, he thought he saw the fabric of the ship itself dissolving with him into a mist of discrete particles, and he knew that he wasn't human anymore, and that nothing was real. And then he plunged headlong into nothingness. Chapter 10. The first thing that came to him was the familiar thud and throb of the auxiliaries. It dragged him back to the point where he could remember what his name was, and then he opened his eyes and sat up. There were solid bulkheads around him, and a solid bunk under him. He felt himself all over, and he was still there. The feel of the ship was different. It was the normal feel of a spaceship, underway and braking. He got up and went out into the passageway. The lights were on again. Men were coming out of their cabins. He wondered if he looked like them, like something dug up and resurrected. His legs didn't work right, and he staggered, trying to run. But they were all staggering, and nobody noticed. There was a rising babble of voices. The ship sounded like an aviary at dawn. He came into the main cabin. He saw faces with tears running down them, but he didn't know whose they were, and he didn't care. The ports were open. For the first time in a million years, the blank walls were opened up, and Comyn flung himself toward the nearest port. Men crowded on his heels, and there was much noise, but he neither felt nor heard. He clung to the thick quartzite and stared at the beautiful deep darkness of space outside. He saw the stars that were no longer eerie crawling worms of light, but bright suns, blazing blue and red and gold and green. They hung in clusters, in ropes and chains, and burning clouds against the primal night. Somebody said, in one long, tumbling breath, "We made it! Oh, God, we made it! We shifted back!" Comyn made himself stop shaking. He looked around the cabin, but the people he wanted were not there, and he went forward to the bridge. The break bursts shook the deck plates under his feet, and it was a good feeling. They were back. They were moving. Everything was all right. Peter and Simon and Stanley were on the bridge. The ports were open here, too, and dead ahead in space was a far-off sun the color of rusty iron, a somber fire burning in the dark. Comyn's feeling of elation drained away. They had made the second big jump, and now it was waiting for them under the light of that mad and wildly fleeing star, the world and the fate that had waited for Ballantyne at the end of that first long trail. Stanley had a sheet of paper, a large one, covered with many figures. He held it out to the navigator. "Here's your destination," he said. The navigator spread out the paper on his workboard and scowled at it. Presently he said, "You've given me too much, mister. The planetary coordinates look okay, and the orbital velocity and grav constant equations and the landing speeds. But all this mess here, these calculations of the relative motions of Ballantyne's ship and Barnard too." Comyn reached over and snatched the paper out of the startled man's hands. He backed away, looking at it, ignoring the sudden angry words that were being said. He said to Stanley, "You memorized all this?" "Of course," said Stanley. He made a grab for the paper. "Damn you, Comyn!" "Yes, you did," said Comyn, and tore the sheet apart. An enraged and startled cry burst from the several different throats, and Comyn thrust the torn scraps into his pockets. He smiled at Stanley. "You can write it out again." Peter swore, a bitter vitriolic stream. "What are you trying to do, Comyn? Aren't things tough enough without—" "He memorized it all," said Comyn. "He's good. He can remember stuff in 3 dimensions, orbital velocities, landing speeds, the works. Give him a pencil and paper. He can write it out again." A glint of understanding came all at once into Peter's eyes. "Sure," he said. "Get him some paper, Simon. I'm sorry this happened, Bill, but there's nothing lost except a little work." "A little work," said Stanley. He looked at Comyn the way a cobra looks at something it can't get at to strike. He said things, very ugly things, but Comyn didn't pay attention to them. He was noticing some sudden changes in Stanley. "What's the matter?" he asked. "A minute ago you were lordly as a hog on ice, and now you don't look so good. Has your memory gone back on you?" Simon came back with pencil and paper and shoved them impatiently at Stanley. "Here, get busy. We haven't all the time in creation." "Time," said Stanley. "If Comyn hadn't interfered—" "A very odd thing has happened," said Peter slowly. "I'm beginning to like Comyn. We have much in common." Stanley threw the pencil on the floor. "I can't do it here," he said. "Nobody could. I'm going to my cabin, and it may take me a little while. Don't disturb me. If there's any more trouble made for me, you'll all pay for it." He stamped out. Nobody spoke until he was gone, and then Comyn said, "Don't blow a fuse. If anything goes wrong, this paper can be pieced together again. I was careful how I tore it." Simon said, "He couldn't have got the logbooks aboard. I examined every piece of baggage myself." "Not the books themselves," said Comyn, "but a couple of micro-photostats could slide by in a pack of cigarettes or a roll of socks." "Well," said Simon, "let's go." "Give him a while," said Peter. "Let him get set. I'll need the master key. Those metal doors don't break open very easy." They waited a little, and then the 3 of them went very quietly through the main cabin, where there were still clusters of men by the ports, and down the passageway to Stanley's cabin. Peter nodded and put the key into the lock. The door swung in. It had taken only a few seconds to open it, but Stanley must have been sitting inside with his reflexes on hair triggers, listening, fearing, hoping, not knowing whether to delay or to hurry, and not daring to do either. There was a large ashtray on his table with a tiny fire burning in it, and Comyn saw the finish of an action that must have started with the first touch of the key to the lock. A roll of microfilm dropped into the fire, flared, and was gone, and Stanley was already scrabbling for the other one, the one he had been copying from. But he couldn't pick it up so easily, because it was pinned under a small but very powerful lens. Comyn sprang forward. Peter and Simon were right with him. They hit Stanley almost together, bore him over, and fell in a sprawling, undignified tangle, 6 hands clawing for the tiny thing that Stanley had tight in his clenched fist. Comyn got his hands around Stanley's wrist and squeezed. Peter was saying, "Look out, don't tear it," and Stanley was trying to fend them all off with one hand and his feet. He was sobbing like a woman and cursing them. Finally, Simon hit him in the face. He went limp for a moment, and his fingers relaxed, and Peter got the film. They rolled off each other and got up, leaving Stanley sitting on the floor with one hand to the side of his face where Simon had struck him. There was a smear of blood at the corner of his mouth. Peter looked down at him. He was breathing hard, and his eyes were ugly. He said to Simon, "Get that paper off him." Simon began to search him roughly. Stanley said, "No!" on a high, rising note, and floundered up. He swung at Simon's head and missed, and Simon hit him again, open-handed this time, contemptuously but hard. "Stop it," he said, "or I'll break your jaw." Peter stepped up and held Stanley's arms from behind. Simon found the paper. "Give it here," said Peter. He let go of Stanley and took the paper. The fire was still smoldering in the big ashtray. He put Stanley's Guarantee of Empire into it and watched it burn. Stanley said, "You can't do that. It isn't that easy." His voice was high. He wiped with the back of his hand at the blood on his mouth. The other roll is gone. The last book. The one about the Transurani. I still know what's in it. You can't get along without me." The ashes crumbled and turned gray. Peter Cochran said slowly, "We'll get along, Bill. You're not a big enough man to bull us out, and you know it. It's time you stopped being a fool." "What do you expect me to do?" asked Stanley savagely. "Agree with you?" "I'm going to make you a proposition," Peter said. "I will give you, in your own name, a fair share of Cochrane Transuranic, and no more than a fair share, no more than any of the others who volunteered for this trip will get. Furthermore, Simon and I will agree to forget your recent behavior." Stanley laughed. "That's big of you. Listen, in a little while you'll be landing on Barnard 2. Unless I tell you what was in that book, the same thing will happen to you that happened to Rogers and Vickery and Strang and Kessel and Ballantyne. You don't dare take that chance." Comyn had started forward at the mention of Rogers' name, but Peter stopped him. "Let me do this." "All right, Bill. So it happens to us, and it doesn't happen to you. Where will you be? Can you pick up the pieces of the expedition and take the survivors home? Or if there aren't any, go back by yourself? There's more to a bluff than words. There's got to be a man to back it up." Stanley said between his teeth, "You're not doing so well with your bluff. The fact you're willing to make concessions at all shows that—" Peter's hand shot out and gripped the front of Stanley's shirt. "Get one thing through your head," said Peter in a very soft voice. "I'm making no concessions to you. I'm thinking of Claudia. Be thankful you're married to a Cochrane, for if you weren't, I'd throw you to the hogs." He flung him off with such fierce contempt that Stanley stumbled and half fell onto the edge of his bunk. "Now, you cheap little chiseler," said Peter, "do you want your job back or don't you?" Stanley was still sitting on the edge of his bunk. He looked at Peter fixedly and then answered him in 4 vicious words. He added, "I've still got you in a cleft stick. You've got to know about the Transurani and what else is on that world. You'll pay for that knowledge or you'll get what Ballantyne got." Peter said harshly, "I've known you a long time, Bill. You're a tough man behind a desk, but not anywhere else. You'll take the share I offered you and be glad of it." He turned away. Comyn's fists itched, but he followed. Stanley shouted furiously after them, "A share in Cochrane Transuranic you'll give me? That's funny, that's very funny. You don't know what the hell you're giving out shares in, but you will, you will." Comyn slammed the door. Peter scowled down at the roll of microfilm in his hand. "That's what old Jonas meant by amateurs who bungle unpredictably. But one thing's sure, he's scared. He's plenty scared, and not of us." 3 days later, they were in an orbit around Barnard 2 and going down.